Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 15 of Thinking Out Loud. As always, I'm your host, Vincent Freeman, and I'm joined here by a very special guest, a Twitter superstar whom I've had the pleasure of meeting. He's one of the nicest guys I've ever encountered, so that's great. His name's Malik Lendell. Did I pronounce that correctly?
I mean, it's it's pronounced Malik Lendell, like
Oh
every
my
time,
God, all right.
but I do know like in Hindi it's Malik, and in other languages it does differ.
Okay.
So like I'm a little more lenient with the pronunciation, but if I say it and you get it wrong, if I presented it first and then you get it wrong, then I'm gonna look at you funny, but
Yeah,
you're
okay.
fine.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry I already screwed up this podcast. It's over.
You're 100% fine.
All right. So I recently I came across you for the first time on Twitter because I usually just like following a bunch of secularists and atheists on there, and I came across you, and you're probably one of the people who is the most vocally anti-theistic, I should say. Is anti-theistic a good term to describe you?
I would say that, yeah, definitely. Because it's weird because I've realized a lot of people, I guess, were confused by how vocally anti-theistic I was regarding the fact that only really, I really considered myself an atheist like only for like a little more than 3 months.
Oh
So,
wow.
right.
Yeah, you were on the I saw your podcast with Abdullah Samir, and you mentioned that you just became an atheist in November. That's just recently. So would you mind
Right.
going through the story of that happening?
So so I was raised Christian actually. I was raised Christian, and my mother was Christian, and most of her family was Christian, and I, how do I just I used to sort of be really invested in that religion and the ideas, but I guess some of the things I didn't realize was that as a Christian, I didn't really know what it meant to be Christian. I guess I didn't really know. All I thought was, oh well, there's God and He's this good being, and then there's all these great stories from the Bible, right? And
Mhm.
so that was sort of my perception of Christianity. And then when I actually started reading parts of the Bible or learning more about what was actually in the Bible, I started questioning it more. Like I remember there was even a time when I saw like this video about contradictions in the Bible. I was watching it with my mother. For some
Oh,
reason that
nice.
didn't turn her off. For some reason that just made her think, oh well, there's a few things messed up in the Bible, a few things that are off. But she's one of those people who sort of cherry picks what's in the Bible. Like she'll say, "Oh yeah, I don't agree with everything in the Bible, but there's some things that are valuable in here." And I'm like, "Okay, you have fun with that." But I um I started questioning. I guess I would say it was really young, like in fourth grade, honestly, because I know there was one day I was like sick or something, and I was hanging out with my grandfather because, well, I wasn't really hanging out. I was there because I was sick and I
Yeah.
couldn't go to school. But he really opened me up to like the ideas of basically other religions or spiritual traditions, particularly African ones, because that's kind of what he's into. He's really into like um, supporting like this idea of African knowledge and consciousness. And while I don't agree with all his views, like it did make me think, oh well, Christianity is not all that's out there, right? And he also opened me up to sort of it was both him and some other people opened me up to the realization like, wait a minute, Christianity was forced on my ancestors, the people from whom I descend, and they practiced other religions. Do I believe that these people were punished for not practicing, you know what I'm saying, for not practicing Christianity? So that sort of started my falling out, I guess I would say, because I know by the time I was in fifth grade, that's when I started taking like a religion class. It was mandatory in uh,
Really?
in my elementary school. It was a private school, so that could have
Oh,
been why. But I really wish we learned about like the irreligion or like lack of religion there
mhm.
too. That would have I think that would have helped me leave the whole entity of religion sooner. But by fifth grade, I was dealing with a lot of sort of cognitive dissonance, trying to reason my Christian beliefs and even mutating them to a certain degree where it was like sort of like Christian, but more to the spiritual side and all. It was just weird how I was even trying to be more syncretic with other beliefs as I learned that other beliefs existed. I would
Mhm.
say I was probably trying to be like an omnist at the time. Um,
Mm.
and I know by sixth grade, though, I totally just was done with Christianity. Like, I did not identify as a Christian at all. I still identified as like a believer in a God,
Uh-huh.
right? But I didn't identify as Christian. And so I think it was when I was in middle school, I didn't really I did think a lot about religion then too. Like I sort of thought of it less as I wasn't necessarily anti-theistic then. I wasn't anti-theistic. Probably only to Christianity I was anti-theistic, right? And I began studying more because I was like, let me study more of my roots, learn about my traditional African roots because that's where knowledge must be, right? No, it's not there. Just because like BS is BS no matter where it comes from, right? But I mean, it's I sort of studied it more and more, and I'm like, I can't force myself to believe in this just because I don't want to believe in Christianity. So I think during like I was still sort of held on to that though for a while, and to this need to feel like I had a religion, I guess, or because I guess I didn't really think of, oh, atheism isn't a choice or agnosticism is a choice, none of those things. But as I came to like through high school, I began sort of taking on more interest in religion, particularly in Islam or and some of the variants of it, because I guess I sort of connect. It was a mix of different things. Like I sort of connected it to, oh, there's Malcolm X, there's Muhammad Ali, great leaders who even left the Nation of Islam for mainstream Islam, right? And then I also got to make friends with people who were Muslim, who I grew really close to, and then even like the influence that Islam had in Black culture, like it was like, of course, it's not like a lot of heavy influence, but there were some superficial influences. Like, for example, a lot of Black people who I know, like the younger generations, are like, I don't eat pork because we know what Elijah Muhammad said about the pork, even though I realized later, like, why are we listening to this dude who's obviously not a nutritionist about what to eat? But yeah, it was like a lot of those superficial things sort of impacted Black culture. Even like the way Black people have been named. Like for example, my name's Malik. That's that. A lot of that naming stuff comes from movements such as the Nation of Islam and other movements, or like more Pan African movements to name children like African names, or and sometimes they say it's African, but it's really Arab names. But that's where a lot of sort of that influence comes from. So it sort of led me to think, oh, Islam might be the one, right? So later, I sort of was more like chill about. I wasn't really studying it in high school, like not in depth enough to really understand what thought I wanted to get into, right? And so I just made more connections, especially online. I made connections with people who are Muslim, trying to learn a little bit more. And of course, they're going to show you only the pretty stuff, right? They're going to show you like, oh, it's this woke religion, we're woke and all this. And I guess it was in college, when I came to college, that's when I really began to sort of look into religion seriously, particularly Islam. And then I realized, like I've had a really close friend who I would discuss it with, and I think it was like when I was actually started doing like reading and research, like especially in there was like which surahs was it? It was Anisa and it was another one I can't remember, but it was like the women or something, and it was so I had to read it for a class too, so that was interesting. I had to read it for a class, and I'm reading it, and it's talking about like women having to be, hit lightly and all this, and see, mind you, I was reading it with a friend of mine. He was like, "Oh, let's read it together," because I guess he thought it was going to be he was going to be my interpreter. And I'm reading it. I'm like, I'm not stupid enough to like let you try to reinterpret these phrases into something that they don't mean, right? So like he was trying to say something about the hitting the women to be like, you don't even slap. It's just like a swipe on the cheek. I'm like, that's not what it says. That's not what it says. Like, let's not play that game. Like, why are we trying to save a book, right? So like it's been a long time for me trying to I was kind of trying to reason it for a little bit because I was like I want to have some semblance of like some cultural identity, something to connect to more, you know. And I think when I realized that was all I was really looking for, it was like because I wanted this idea of oh I'm part of a community, right? And I think that was a lot of what influenced my seeking of a religion, you
Hmm.
know. And I mean like I do like the feeling that like I went to a masjid a couple of times and I like the way they it feels in there, you know, because but it's because of the way it's because there's people in there like a community in there. It's not necessarily because oh this is the true way, you know what I'm saying? It's not because of the way it's because of the community, it's because of the small little habits that you do, you know, when you do wudu and clean your face and everything. Like I found that to be like somehow like even though inherently it doesn't mean nothing, like it doesn't mean nothing inherently, but the actual doing of it, the application of meaning is what makes it valuable, and the fact that you're doing it together with other people, you know. So I think when I came to that realization that that was why I was sort of seeking religion. I was like, you know, I can find this in other this community I want. I can find in other ways, and also I came to the realization that like I think I was talking to my friend actually um, about I forgot what it was actually, but it was related to something about Islam that I had an issue with, and and I think it was sort of random when he mentioned like, well, are you atheist or are you like agnostic or something like that? And I don't think at the time I didn't really consider myself either. I didn't even think to consider myself any of those things. And the way he said like it would be smarter for you to be an agnostic than an atheist, and that sort of threw me off because I'm like, first off, who are you to tell me what is smarter to be? And second off, I'm like, I never even put that out there. And so I just sort of had to think of it. I was like, I don't even want to talk to religion with you anymore, right? I was like, let's not talk about this anymore because I'm sort of done because you kind of crossed the line, right? And so at the time, I did start questioning even deeper because I'd already questioned sort of other religion before at that point, right? And I was already iffy about committing fully to one because I was like, why would I like should I commit to something when I don't know what I'm stepping into fully? Like I know the basics, but I don't align with the idea of get to know the basic stuff before you learn everything else. You know what I'm saying? Like they say you should. A lot of people say you should learn the basics of Christianity or the basics of Islam, and then you can accept it, and then you can learn everything else after. And I think that's a good way to get scammed, honestly. And especially if the basics don't necessarily relate to the other stuff that's involved, right? Like, what are the five pillars going to tell me about a woman being smacked, basically, you know, or not being hit in the face, or whatever the book says, you know? Like, what is it going to tell me about all the specifics that don't have anything to do with the basics? So yeah, that was my issue with sort of the idea of stepping into a religion, because most of my perception comes more from the um, not necessarily from the specifics of religion. Like I do have issues with the specifics of religion, but I'm coming from the more general theme of religion as a whole, as an institution. Like why step into something halfway blind. Like I know people say, "Oh, you have to have blind faith," but I can have blind faith in literally anything. So that's not enough for me. You know, like as someone who's been involved in like at least one other religion, you know. So it doesn't mean much to me, especially when I come in contact with people of other faiths so often, whether that be like the Black Israelites or the 5% or Sunni Muslims, just anyone, So it just doesn't make sense to me. But yeah, I became atheist once I actually started looking. Well, I didn't. I identified, I guess, as atheist. I realized it made more sense than anything else I was doing because I was trying to rationalize so much, and I realized even at that point, though thought I believed in a God, right? I realized that God was just a reflection of it was a mixture of things. It was a reflection of what I aspired to be, what I thought was goodness, along with some remnants from my previous Christian faith, right? So I realized that's what it was, and I was like, well, it makes no sense for me to believe in a God outside of the context of a religion or a particular faith system, right? Because what does that even mean? What does it mean for me to believe in a God outside of Christianity when I'm not defining it as like the deistic God, and then
Yeah.
it just sort of went away, and I was like, well, I can't unsee that,
Mhm.
can't unsee that. So after, like, from that day, I think it was during my birthday month actually. So I was just about to turn 21, and I think I might have sort of started. I think at that point I just started like posting stuff on my Facebook, like a lot
Oh
of stuff.
no.
It was a lot of like memes about, and that's not. Of course, that wasn't a good move on my part, but a lot of it was memes or like commentaries on the Quran and stuff like that. But I guess a lot of my family who was following me, they were more confused because I guess some of them thought I was still Christian, which which really confused me. I'm like, how did y'all think I was still Christian? But like, I guess they didn't really think much of it until I started posting stuff about Christianity too. So once I started posting about Christianity, they were like, "Oh, this boy is an atheist."
Mhm.
And so I think around then I had an auntie call just like she was like, "What happened to your Christian faith?" on one of my posts. I'm like, what? Where did that come from? She was trying to call me. I was just not in the mood to talk to anyone in the family though. So I was like, y'all can talk to my mother. And I shouldn't have said that. I should have just talked to them myself, instead of throwing them to my mother, because I was like, I don't know. My mother, she had her own feelings about it, but I thought she would be more on my side because she was like, I don't identify as Christian, but I guess it was an issue of um, maybe she just didn't want the family to, view her as like, oh well, I'm the mother of a non-Christian boy, and now he's out about his not being a Christian, and he's an atheist on top of that.
Mhm.
So that might have been a problem for her. But yeah, ever since then, I'm like, whatever. I'm just gonna share my stuff. You're gonna hear me. I still say I'm in a angry atheist phase. I keep telling myself it's gonna end, but it doesn't. Something ever always comes up.
The angry atheist phase is the best phase to go through, I promise you. After that, it just gets really boring. But there's so many topics that we could really jump into from your story right there. I suppose the first thing, one of the things that sort of your story revolved around was the idea of community. And you said that you yourself read the Bible, or at least you read parts of the Bible, parts of the Quran, at the very least as a piece of literature. Can you appreciate it then? And then if you do appreciate it as a piece of literature, can you appreciate the fact that other people around there, because they like the literature that they're reading, they form communities and they form a bond because of that?
I would have to say I think I can't really speak on that too much because I don't think people can. While I think people form communities around this literature, it's different when it comes to like other forms of literature because you're taught to love these forms of literature. You're not taught to think critically about them. You're taught to love them no matter what. With other literature, you're taught to question, to think about it, and you can love it based on your own sort of accord. But when it comes to the Quran or to the Bible, you're supposed to love it. That's the point. Like, um, like if it was like, oh, let's form a book club and around some favorite literature of ours, like you get to choose what your favorite literature is. You don't really get that opportunity with the Quran and Bible, especially if you're taught at a young age, like this is like beautiful literature. This is from God. You're supposed to love it, So I think I can appreciate that, yes, religion, especially religions with like scriptures and all that, they do give you something to gather around, but I think they sort of steal that from us as humans. I think they sort of steal that ability for us for us to think that we can gather around other things without religion. Because I think they really steal our ability to truly and fully be human, and they steal our individuality, they steal our sense of identity, they steal our sense of community without it. They think we can't build communities without it, and people fear losing that religion and I think it really comes down to a sense of loss of identity and a sense of a loss of that community. And it's not even a sense of the loss of community, it's the fact that communities will shun you, they will leave you, like oftentimes, because you don't decide to follow the religion. So it's not even like a lot of religious people will try to blame it on, oh, well, you left the religion, this is God punishing you. No, it's y'all punishing the person. So let's not play that game of God punishing us, because it's really the community punishing us.
Hmm.
So religion, I just feel like it's essentially a thief. It's an appropriator, and it appropriates our humanity and our identities.
Mhm. That's a brilliant way of putting it. Yeah, it appropriates the way our need to belong. This is one of the things that I always respond with when people, religious apologists like Jordan Peterson, say that, well, in the absence of religion, what community are you supposed to have? Because there are genuine cases out there of people who lose their religion and feel like there is a sense of them missing. But I think the obvious response to that is, well, when you're taught as a child that this is what you're supposed to love, that this is where your community comes from, of course you're going to end up, whenever you inevitably lose it, if you're a curious cat, of course it's going to feel like you're missing something. So I think step number one is to don't teach these things as infallible doctrines. I think it's a good way to teach literature, because I think the Bible, or really any Abrahamic text, probably was the genesis of English literature. And I think they can be beautiful as them. Obviously, don't take it literally, because then
Right.
you're gonna run into problems. Um, but I completely wholeheartedly agree with you on your analysis. And you mentioned identity, the fact that people really sort of associate these communities, or associate these religions, not so much as community, but it's as an identity. And when in one of your videos, you referred to as the two different types of identities. There's a prescriptive identity and a descriptive identity. Would you mind going into that? That was a very interesting thing that you brought up.
Well, I'm surprised you watched that. Thank you for watching it.
Oh, of
But
course.
yeah, like
Everyone listening to this, watch his videos. They're great.
right.
Rising star on YouTube.
Right. Like, I went into the idea of a prescriptive identity and a descriptive identity originally on Abdullah Samir's channel, actually, when I was talking to him. And I wanted to sort of elaborate on it on that video. So basically, a prescriptive identity, I say it's an identity in which you basically, for example, I sort of mentioned this earlier, like about how people expect you to learn the basics maybe of a religion, right? And then you take on that identity of a religion. So let's say I learned the 5 pillars of Islam, and I say, oh, those are the basics of Islam, right? And I say, well, now I'm gonna do the shahada and become Muslim, right? And and then after that I have to take on everything else that it means to be a Muslim, right? And I have to protect everything else that means being a Muslim, right? So I don't feel like it's a honest position to hold, because you're not really believing in these things based on knowledge and agreement. You're believing in them because of your identity is saying you have to believe in them, right? But with a descriptive identity, like being an atheist, for example, that describes me. Like, it's literally a one, like, you can tell the difference between a prescriptive identity and a descriptive identity usually by the fact that one has a shorter description. Like, one, you could just say at one moment. Like for example, being an atheist is me not believing in any gods, and it's short and simple. And I know some people try to even say it might be what's the word? They might try to say it's intellectually dishonest to say you're like a Gnostic atheist versus an agnostic. I feel like it's honest as long as you know what you believe in. You know, if you know what you believe in, I feel like it's honest. And I consider myself a Gnostic atheist. I'll probably get into the reasons for that later. But
Okay.
like I feel like if you know what you believe in, and if you're not like saying, "Oh, well, I believe in this thing just because of my identity," then I can take you seriously. I'll be able to understand that. Okay, you're being honest. So I generally don't agree with the idea of. I guess that goes into the fact that I don't agree with the idea of even if I were to start believing in some sort of God, whatever that would mean, that I still probably wouldn't align myself with a religion, you know, because I would probably just call myself a theist then, and I wouldn't because I feel like the term theist is at least is a descriptive identity. Unlike most religions, people just take it on as a prescriptive identity. They just say, "Oh, I learned a few things. Let me take on this label, and then I'm gonna take everything else that comes with this label." Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense, especially in the context of religion, when as soon as you're born and you're told that you're a Christian child or a Muslim child, you then adopt the values that you're expected to adopt. So yeah, when I saw that video, I'm like, huh, that's interesting. That's one of the things that I never really thought about. What other sort of contents are you planning on producing for your YouTube channel? Is it just strictly going to be focused on religion?
I'm I'm thinking I'm gonna talk more about identity, and I'm gonna do some fun things here and there. You know, like I did it was like a dance thing just to lighten people's hearts. And I was just because it was fun. I love music. I'm a big fan of music, especially Erica Badu. Got a shirt on with one of her lyrics. You probably can't see it. It says, "If we were made in His image, then call us by our names." Love Erica Badu. But yeah, like I'm planning on doing more content about secularism, but also about religion, about culture, like Black culture especially, because like that's where I get my sense of identity from. I know it. I know that like any culture, it's constructed. I understand that it's a constructed idea, constructed culture, right? But I do believe like I draw a lot of my stuff from what is seen as Black culture, right? So and I don't have any shame in that, but I also don't have any shame in admitting that it's a constructed culture is constructed anyways. We have to construct our own sense of identity. Even I think TMM went into it on one of his videos. But yeah, it's you have to construct your own sense of identity and your own culture, and you can't let religion or anyone else sort of do that for you.
hmm Are you ever concerned about the effects that tribalism could have on some people's visions of identity? So some people will associate themselves, for instance, with a particular culture, and whenever that culture is at odds with, let's say, the law, or let's say with other cultures, they'll immediately associate themselves with their culture and immediately believe that their culture is right because that is a part of identity. So I suppose that's a broad way of describing tribalism in a sense.
Oh
So are you
yeah,
ever concerned about that?
I am concerned about that a lot because I really do I do think that it's like my I value humanism over culture and religion and all that. You know, so any sort of structure, whether it be culture, whether it be religion, whether it be like countries and all nationalism or whatever, if it goes against someone's well-being, that's when I'm against it, right? So if it's something, because I consider myself like heavily liberal. So like, if you do what you want, do what you want so long as you're not impeding on someone else's rights, right? Or you're
hmm
not impeding someone's safety. And I because I hold that perspective, it also means that I want people to have their greatest amount of freedoms, the greatest amount of. I want them to have a great well-being too, but I don't want culture to ever get in the way of that.
Okay. Ooh, and you touched on the topic of morality there. So this is something that I definitely want to talk to you with because when you lost your belief, Like for instance, I realized that when I lost my belief, I viewed other topics that were seemingly completely different. I viewed them differently. So, for instance, on the topic of free will, when I was religious, I always assumed we had free will because that's one of the expectations if there is a God. He gives you free will, and then it depends on how you use that free will on how you be judged. But I viewed free will differently, and I embraced the idea that we could be living in a completely deterministic universe, a completely materialistic universe, much more. And I viewed morality in the same way. Initially, my knee-jerk reaction is that, well, morality therefore must be subjective. But then I listened to arguments made by Paul Bloom, made by Sam Harris and Sean Carroll, and you say, well, maybe there's a case to be made for moral realism. So what is your foundation for morality? How do you view morality now? And is the way that you view things like morality and free will different now that you lost your faith?
I would say it. I don't even know if I really thought about it as in depth as like when I was a believer. I don't think I thought of morality super in depth, other than like I had this sort of sense inherently of what was right or wrong, and I never really had to argue about it, right? But
Mm,
later on, as I did begin questioning my faith, I did come into more arguments because I would sort of discuss like once, especially once I became atheist, I came into discussions more often with my friend who I used to talk to about Islam, right?
mm,
So I think my perspective is that I don't think morality is something that is like inherent about our universe. I don't think there's anything like any objective morality, whatever that would mean, because most people who present the idea of objective morality, it seems like what they're really trying to say is a consistent morality that's in their book and nothing more. But I feel like, well, from my understanding, morality should be based in whatever promotes well-being of all people. But I do think a lot of it is sort of etched into most people's brains. Like we do have a capability of empathy, most human beings. Other people have different levels of that, but we do have a general capability of empathy, which allows us to which helps us to be moral people, right? But not everyone has that, regardless of religion or irreligion or whatever. But people do have tend to have that capability, and also it just helps us to have some sort of moral law in order to make sure that people aren't like hurting other people, or to make sure that we are following rules that keep us all in check so that we can sort of work for the greater good of all humans within our societies.
mm-hmm.
So I don't think there's anything like inherently. I don't think believe in an inherent sort of morality, but I do think it's helpful for our society, and I do think um, most people's capabilities of empathy does help promote this sort of morality. It
Yeah,
helps
that's a
make it. I,
Yeah, I don't think morality is ingrained within the universe, as you said.
Mhm.
The way I view morality is, I suppose you could call myself a moral realist. And so, what Paul Bloom and what Sam Harris sort of argue for is that the baseline assumption of every moralistic principle is that the one thing that we all want to do is, as you said, increase the well-being of a society. So even if, even an Islamic fundamentalist who's going into the nearest embassy and blowing himself up, hoping to get the highest kill count, he's doing so under the impression that he is increasing the well-being of society for the future. He's making a better society that Allah wants. And so everyone effectively has that general principle of morality. That's generally speaking what everybody expects when we're talking about morality. And so if that's the case, then morality is just as objective as health is, where there's no reason why you ought to be healthy, right? If we're going back to David Hume's is and ought distinction, there's no reason why you ought to be healthy. There's no reason why you should be healthy. But if our goal is to be healthy and we have clear definitions of what it means to be healthy and what it means not to be healthy, then there are objective methods at becoming healthier. Same thing with morality. There's no reason why you ought to be moral, but the fact of the matter is we all generally want to be moral because we evolved billions of years to want to be moral because it increased the likelihood that we're going to pass on our genes. And because we have a clear definition of morality, then we have objective metrics for determining what is more moral than other things. So that's the way I view morality, moral realism, I suppose. And so, have you listened to like the works of like Sam Harris and Paul Bloom? When you first started becoming an atheist, were you like into the whole four horsemen of atheism, like Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins?
I didn't really listen to them a lot. The first people who I really came across was I remember like genetically modified skeptic.
Oh, he's great.
Yeah, and also it was cosmic skeptic. I came across apostate prophet. Who else? I think Yasmin Muhammad too, um, and Vidu Vids. I think there were some of the main people who I remember coming across first. I can't remember everyone, but those were some of the main rationality rules too. Yeah.
Rational. Those are all absolutely top-notch picks. Cosmic Skeptic was the guy who convinced, or not convinced me literally, but who sort of influenced me to make my own YouTube channels. So a lot of the way that I sort of personalize my videos, like just me in front of like my bookshelf and my desk, comes straight from Cosmic Skeptic. So I'm a Cosmic Skeptic ripoff. Um, so another thing I wanted to ask you is that the reason there are different reasons why people lose their faith, right? I know a lot of people that lost their faith strictly for moral reasons, where they'll read the Bible and they say, I don't agree with this morally speaking, so therefore it must not be true. But I think that's different from reading the Bible and saying, I don't believe this is true, not for moral reasons, but for logical reasons. Like this, there's so many contradictions. This is historically inaccurate, philosophically dubious. So what do you think about the difference between people who lose their faith in, you know, for moral reasons? Just because they don't agree with it morally doesn't mean that it could still be true. It's
Right.
just we just have a dictator ruling us, as Christopher Hitchens said, a celestial North Korea that we're living in. What do you think? Do you disagree with people who lose their faith just for purely moral reasons, or are you like, well, so long as you reach the right answer, it doesn't really matter how you get there?
I mean, honestly, I don't think either way is a problem
Hmm.
because, and my reasoning is, like, I think you can believe that a God exists, right? If you want, but like if a God were to exist, does that mean whatever a God would be? Would that mean that you need to follow that God? You know what I'm saying? Would that
Hmm.
mean that that being deserves to be followed? So that would be the issue then. So I would say if it's for moral reasons or not, I feel like it's a legitimate reason. Like, why are we labeling this God as someone who deserves to be followed regardless? What's the
Yeah,
point?
and I wanted to ask you what do you think the best argument for religion is? But you mentioned earlier in the podcast that you're a Gnostic atheist, right? Did I hear you
Yeah.
correctly?
Yep.
Well, all right. So make your case then. For a Gnostic atheist is someone who knows that there's no God, right?
Yeah.
So make your case then. How do you
So
know?
so I know this mostly because like I identify also as an atheist. So you may have seen like a video on
Hmm.
that. I don't know. So I think the term God is, and I might have to find a new sort of way to identify, I guess, to really clarify my point. But why are we? I don't like entertaining the term God. That's my main issue. I don't like to entertain the term God because to me it's a meaningless title. Most of the times it is when I hear religious people utilizing it, particularly Christians or Muslims, what they tend to do are they fall for a lot of equivocation fallacies in which they argue for, often, especially with the beginning of the universe, they will argue for like some sort of deistic God that had to create the universe, and then they'll apply it to their God, which is a totally different God. And it's like you're playing around with the semantics of the term. So I don't really like giving credence to the term God, right? So I feel like what I feel like the term God in itself is meaningless, and I like as I said, what does God mean outside of the context of a religion, right? So what does God really mean outside the context of a religion? And when I looked at Christianity, like if I see contradictions in there, I'm like, okay, the Christian God couldn't be real if we are defining the Christian God by what's in the Bible, right? So if there's contradictions in there, that God is out. right? Same with Islam. That God's out too because there's contradictions in the Quran too.
Hmm.
And then we know, like, for example, the Greek gods don't exist. Like, they're not on Mount Olympus living there. People have been on Mount Olympus. So I just sort of come to the conclusion that what we define as gods are just the unreachable things, or it's often either something that's unreachable or it's a synonym for something else. So I would rather talk in terms of what that something else is as opposed to calling it God, right? Like I'd rather say, oh, we're talking about Allah, right? Or, oh, we're talking about Zeus. Or, oh, if you're a pantheist, we're talking about the universe. Let's say the universe instead of calling it God, right? Or if you are like sort of like the 5% Nation, have you heard of them actually? They're like the Nation of Islam, but even stranger. They believe that the black man is God, as they say. And I'm
Hmm.
like, then you're just making it a synonym for you're just making it a synonym for being a black man, right? So it's it really is, to me, I don't like entertaining the term because it's just a meaningless title. Even the term creator, it means very little to me. It's like, so you're just defining the role of whatever that entity, being, force, or whatever it could be. You're just defining its role. You're not defining what it is.
Hmm.
Because you could easily say, oh, the Big Bang itself was the creator. Like, what does the creator really mean? It just can be anything. You're just defining the role it has and not necessarily what it is. So I find it very useless entertaining the term God itself. I think it really leads to a useless debate, in my opinion. Like people say, oh well, there might be a God, and I know some people, some atheists actually, some agnostic atheists, they have an issue with me making that claim. That I know for sure, but it's more geared towards the agnostic definition, and I feel like the fact that I think it's mostly just the term God that really troubles me. It's
Hmm.
more that the term is troubling, and why would we identify something as God? Because I don't deny that people, like I don't deny, yeah, people believe in gods. People, what people may call gods, though, would be, I would question, why are you considering it a god, and why is that thing that you're calling God deserving of such a title, and is that thing even real itself? So I don't even, I was thinking about it earlier actually. I want to sort of think of a way to sort of clarify that even better. Like I don't think, like I think the term God is a more of a title that in itself doesn't have much meaning or worth.
Hmm.
Like I'm sure people may, like for example, if you're a pantheist, like, and you believe that the universe is essentially God, like yeah, the universe exists, but why are we calling it God, right?
Yeah.
And the same with other gods, like just call it by, if your God has a name, call it by its name. If it doesn't, define it clearly for me, and then we'll disprove it together.
Yeah, that's true. I feel like that's generally a problem with liberal interpretations of religion, where because they don't like the very literal interpretation, in Deuteronomy, they're like, oh, yeah,
Hmm.
he's not okay with with homosexuality. So let's interpret that so much so in a liberal fashion to the point where it almost loses all its meaning, and we don't even need the Bible in the first place. So
Hmm.
that's always been it's funny. So I'm minoring in religious studies and philosophy. And so in one of my classes, uh, towards the end of the quarter, me and my professor started talking, and he asked me, "Are you like a hardcore conservative Christian?" And I was taken aback. I'm like, "What are you talking about? Hell no! I'm like a hardcore liberal atheist." And he said, "I could have sworn based on like how critical you were of liberal interpretations of religion." And I go, "Okay, that makes sense." He thought because I'm much more critical of liberal interpretations of scripture than I am of conservative ones, strictly for the reason that I think it is important to interpret scripture as it is historically accurate. And if we're going by historicity, which I think can be rich for understanding the general zeitgeist, the general moral zeitgeist of the people living back at the time, you kind of have to interpret it in a very conservative manner because that's most like people always try to say that Jesus was a socialist liberal hippie.
Right.
In a way, you could view it that way, but at the same time, he also claimed that he wasn't there to outlaw the laws of the Pharisees, that he was here to reinforce it by the sword. And I really doubt that Jesus, someone living in 0 AD Palestine, was this feminist icon of the time. Like he wasn't woke as woke as you think he was. He's still
Mhm.
pretty, he justified slavery, for instance, when his
Mhm.
disciples asked him about that. And so that's why I've always been very critical of this, as you mentioned, this pantheistic version of religion, that God is everywhere. I'm like, oh, yeah, I have intellectual problems with those, because if you're not basing it on the Bible, you're literally just coming up with it out of thin air.
Mhm.
But for me, I always viewed that the general consensus, at least in the United States, where 72% of Americans consider themselves Christians, at least in the general template for a belief in God would be a conscious creator, someone who consciously created the universe out of nothing. Have you heard of the Kalam argument, the Kalam cosmological argument?
Yes, I have way
All
too
right.
much.
So what would be your response to that then? Because it is a genuine mystery when you look out into the universe and you see constants like epsilon, like lambda, and they all seem to just be completely fine-tuned, where if they were moved just 1 millionth of a millimeter to the right or to the left,
Mhm.
you wouldn't the universe as we know it wouldn't be able to exist. And I hear this all the time
Mhm.
because I'm majoring in physics, and so you'll get religious physicists talking to me
I
about
think
it.
is a really ridiculous concept because it's like they always say, oh, it's so fine, we have a finely tuned universe and everything is so perfect, right?
Hmm.
But my issue with that is finely tuned compared to what? What is it perfectly? It's perfectly made for us compared to what? What are we comparing this to? Do we have another universe that exists that we know of that's not finely tuned for us? Because I can think of many things that would make this universe better for us. I can think of many things that would make it better for us. So what are we comparing it to? Is there some universe in your mind or that you're making up, right? Like I don't get it. I don't even like to entertain it because it's like, have you seen another universe? What do you have to compare it to? So I just don't understand even why people entertain it because it's like they don't have nothing to compare the universe
Well,
to even say it's better.
yeah, I mean, I think the argument that really to steelman them would be that we don't really need to compare it to any other universe, because the fact of the matter is that you know, we know what the universe would look like if the constants were different. And the fact that the constants are set in such a place that it makes conditions ripe for us to live, and if they were moved, if you just change these constants just a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction, then the universe wouldn't be able to accelerate enough to the point where it continues expanding, or it would collapse in on itself. That is a huge coincidence that these parameters are set the way that they are. So it can't be a
I mean,
coincidence.
it has to
Someone
be
must.
something though. It has to be something. Because like, of course we're gonna think, because I think a lot of religion makes us narcissistic about our existence. Like we think too highly of ourselves, and I think that perspective sort of makes us think, oh, we were one out of so many chances that could have been, so we must be special. No, we were just a chance. That's how I view it. We were just a chance. That means we were just one of the fortunate chances to come up. I guess I don't even know if
Yeah.
fortunate is the right word because otherwise it wouldn't have mattered, right?
Hmm.
But the fact that we can even think that is just it's just a result of chance in my perspective. Like I think it's just I don't get it personally. I hear that argument and my view is that we're one of many chances. Of course, if we happen to be that one chance, we're going to have the ability to think, "Oh yeah, we're so fortunate." Like, but we wouldn't have had that ability to think, "Oh man, darn it, we're not fortunate enough to have existed." We're going to think that if we
Yeah.
happen to exist. So, what else? What other thing would there be for us to think?
Yeah. The way I always view it is that you have to ignore a lot of things to take seriously the Kalam cosmological argument. You have to ignore the fact that you could tune the parameters differently and make conditions even more conducive to life. So you could make a universe in which we would have just come into existence only 1,000 years after the Big Bang, or even just 1 million years after the Big Bang.
Mhm.
God really had to wait a long, long time until he made the universe ripe enough for us to come into existence. And also, I do take seriously the idea of the multiverse. So, quick physics lesson, since I have you all here. Um, there's different theories in physics that all lead us in a general direction towards the idea that there could be a multiverse. This is inflation theory, string theory, M theory, many different ideas in physics. And we're all pointed in the direction that our universe is not the only one. There's an infinite number of universes, and that in most of these universes, the conditions for life aren't ripe enough for us to exist. So obviously, in most of them, there's no one there. But obviously, we're asking the question of how could we possibly be here? Because as you said, well, we happen to be in one. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be asking the question in the first place. And so I think the multiverse should be taken seriously. Lawrence Krauss is a theoretical physicist. He went to MIT. He talks about this all the time. He's like, I don't even like the multiverse, but we're driven to it by different ideas in physics. And so we have to take it seriously because, the reason why he doesn't like it is because if the multiverse is real, that means that physics is random and we're never going to be able to have a unifying understanding of physics, complete. And I share that sentiment. But even then, you also can take seriously the idea that the universe isn't finely tuned for us, but rather we're finely tuned for the universe. Because we came into existence billions upon billions of years after the Big Bang happened. So we sort of acclimated ourselves to the conditions that the universe set for us rather than the other way around. And there was another physicist, I forget his name, but he was talked about in Michael Shermer's book, Giving the Devil His Due, where he ran a simulation and he tried to determine if he created a set number of universes and how many a number of these universes would life eventually be conducive, right? It could be billions of years in the future, quintillions of years in the future. And he found that in at least half of them, life would eventually emerge. So it's not as rare as people would expect. So, but I do think that's the strongest argument that they have because it is so easily to fall trap for it. It's so easy. It's genuinely one of the topics that you really have to think deeply about to realize just why it doesn't make sense and why it's a silly argument. So now let's talk about religion and whether or not it's benign and whether or not we should at least allow religion for community purposes. So you describe yourself as an anti-theist, I suppose, right?
Atheist, but also an anti-theist as well.
Okay.
Anti-theist heavily, very much so, because I mean I realized like I personally wouldn't say I've gone through like I've had instances in which I would say like religion has had a few negative impacts in my life, but I would never say it was like so drastic where like it just caused me, it didn't cause me like pain. I do feel like I wasted a lot of my life, a lot of my time on thinking about religion, but that definitely doesn't compare to the to what I've seen other people or heard other people go through with religion. And I think that that's really what motivated me to even speak out about it, to talk more about it, especially on my platforms, especially my Twitter, because like I think it was related to it was when I heard what about Yasmin Muhammad and what she was going through, and other people, especially on Drew from Genetically Modified Skeptic. He had a video about ex-Muslim people, and Yasmin Muhammad was there, and I believe he featured other people. I can't remember from the top of my head, but that's when I've heard sort of her story, and I've heard other people's story, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and many other people, and I'm like, whoa, this is wild, right? So I was like, I can't just like see myself just being silent and not saying anything, because like I'm one of those people who really is a big I'm big for the global push of humanism and liberalism. Like I'm for humanism globally. I'm not one of those, oh, let's only do it for the US,
Mm.
But I felt like it was necessary for me to at least say something, to share my voice, because I'm like I'm in a privileged position where I can. So I figured, why not do that? Why not speak up, regardless of the costs, and just go ahead and do it. So that's sort of, I think it's, I do think I'm not one of those people who are going to go like say, oh, you're an evil person, you're a bad person for following religion, right? I'm not going to go to people like that or anything. But I think religion has the possibility of taking the bad outs of people, but in the end, I do believe that people are responsible for their own goodness and their own bad behavior, regardless of their religion. I do believe that, but I also think there is a extent of the religion does train you to
Hmm.
behave in a particular manner as well. So I think it's sort of a mix between that. Like you have to take a certain level of responsibility for yourself, but also like I do understand religion does impact the way people act.
Hmm.
And I am very much anti-religious because like of the way religion impacts law, like not even just in the U.S. but in other parts of the world, right?
Hmm.
And the way it impacts people's actual lives, right? Like it can like people get killed for leaving religion, or they can be shunned. You know, they they may not have the ability to have like a true full life because of the religion they were born to without choice oftentimes, right? So I'm anti-religion for that reason, but I'm also anti-religion because I feel like there is sort of this tendency to be anti-scientific in general. Like that's like a big issue to me, especially in this current climate with people trying to deny that they need to practice social distancing, you know, because they're covered in the blood of Jesus, right? That's what someone in Missouri said that, I think, and I heard that in the news, and I'm like, we have no hope here,
Yeah.
right? But yeah, like that's an issue for me because it's like I would be able to maybe, if you want to believe whatever you want to believe, if you want to play a game of pretend, I'm cool with that. I used to play pretend when I was younger, but I'm not interested in your games of pretend impacting the laws that affect me. I'm not interested in them impacting youth against their will. I'm very much like against religious indoctrination. So if I could, I would make it illegal to make people uh, make force their children into religion if I had that ability. Like I don't mind like if it's the stuff that if it impacts like your if you're teaching them this as like a sole truth, I'm against that. Like if you want to teach them your religion but not teach it as a sole truth, I'm I guess I'd be okay with that. But the fact that it is treated as a sole truth, the fact that female and male genital mutilation is a thing, you know, and the fact that it impacts the way like even like blood transfusions and all that stuff, like the fact that it impacts all those things is problematic for me because it's like you're a parent and you can make certain decisions regarding the health of your child and regarding their well-being, but some things that are tied to religion aren't they're not really it's not really about well-being at a such point. Some of it is just it's just about sort of forcing them and marking them as a part of that religion as opposed to truly caring about their well-being. And I'm heavily against that. But in general, I'm anti-religious, but I'm not going to go after people specifically because of their religion. I'm just going to like I share my content. And if you're one of those combative people though, I might go after you just because why not? But if you're like a casual practicer, I'm not going to go after you.
Yeah. My concern with people who say like, well, so long as they practice it in the confines of their own home and they're not hurting anybody, who
Hmm.
cares? I go like, yeah, obviously, who cares? I'm not going to force them out of a religion. But it does concern me that they already have a flawed epistemology, that they already have a flawed understanding about the origin of the universe, and I'm concerned about how this is going to affect their other belief systems. And so, a quick question: you said that if you could wave a wand or whatever, you would outlaw child indoctrination, right? Would you rather outlaw child indoctrination, or would you rather increase the level of scientific literacy in a society to the point where people themselves don't want to indoctrinate their child, where they're informed enough to know the gravity of the situation?
Yeah, I would do the latter for sure. But I feel like there's always going to be some way where I feel like people will reason
Hmm.
or I feel like religion would just sort of evolve. Like it has for a while, I feel like maybe we won't have Christianity no more, but we'll have some new religion. You know what I'm saying? That
Yeah.
maybe applies some sort of science, because there's always going to be something unknown, and I feel like that's what a lot of what religion sort of appeals to, whatever is unknown. So I feel like it'll just appeal to a new unknown as we increase our scientific knowledge, because obviously we're not going to have all the knowledge. So religion is going to find its nooks between those parts that we lack knowledge in. That's what I
Yeah.
feel like.
Some people are saying that's happening that within the realm of politics, where because a lot of the people on the, and I'm someone who is on the left, I've never thought about voting for anybody with a red tie in my life. But some people are saying that there are people who are genuinely on the left who they've sort of formed a religion out of their politics, where if you were to
Mhm.
ask them, well, what's your stance on climate change? And they tell you, oh, of course I believe in climate change. I think it's a horrible natural disaster, which I do think it is. But then you can immediately guess what their positions are on other topics that are completely unrelated to climate change. And
Right.
goes back to our conversation about tribalism. And it seems like they're forming groups, these coalitions.
Mhm.
It almost comes across as a religion. Some people are saying like there's a term around there thrown around referred to as the progressive left, right?
Mhm.
They're saying like they sort of formed a religion, and a good portion of them are secularists. And
Mhm.
some psychologists like Jonathan Haidt from NYU, he says a good reason why they seem to be working in this way is because a lot of them are lacking religion, are lacking that community group, so they're
Mhm.
trying to find it in politics. Do you think there's any credence to that argument?
I don't know how I feel about like the whole argument. I can definitely see it. Like I consider myself like very liberal. I don't necessarily identify fully with like the Democrats or any of those sort of left wing people generally. Like I do share some ideology, some ideas with them. I do agree on some things, but overall, I don't associate with them because I I'd rather would form my own opinions based on something. Like I don't think a lot of people tend to I think they tend to cling to one thing, like I said, with the prescriptive versus descriptive identities. Like I think it's more of a prescriptive identity. Like they see a few things they might agree with, take on that identity, and then they cling on to everything else.
Yeah.
And I'd rather just not identify with that. I'd rather identify as someone who's very liberal in the way that I want politics to be carried out. I guess like.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good view. So the last question I want to ask you is the question of trying to convince other people to join your side and what's the best way. So the most popular way, or one of the most popular methods that have come into the public limelight recently is the whole street epistemology thing, right?
Mhm.
You just ask people, you probe them, how they know what they know. Very intimate one-on-one usually works well. And then there's the other one that became popularized back in like 2015, 13, 14, which is the Christopher Hitchens owning the opposition. And those are very, very fun. What do you think is the most effective method of convincing the other person to join your side, or at the very least, to get them to sort of think about your position, even if they don't fully agree with it?
I I've been thinking about that as well a lot. Like I do watch a lot of street epistemologists like Anthony Magnabosco, and I even watch people who are more like about owning the other side. Um, like
Ben
in the
Shapiro
atheist,
owns libtards.
like in the atheist experience, for example. But I myself would say, like I can do a little bit of both. I feel like because I feel like there is a certain extent to where there's some people who just have you have to really check their ego. You know what I'm saying? Like because a lot of people they take their identity and conflate it with their beliefs. And I that's a really huge problem to me because what it tells me is that you're really interested in protecting that sense of identity you hold as opposed to holding true beliefs, right? So I really have to. Sometimes it's harder to get through to people with that. So you have to own them because it's they have you have to set them aside and let them know that their ego they're tripping and they need to let go of that ego and you have to own them because there's no other way to get through to them. And a lot of it I realize is less about trying to convince that person, especially since I do most of my discussion now on Twitter. It's less about that person and more about what other people see, right? So it's I guess is you have to do a mix of both because I don't feel like alone that they work. I feel like it depends on the person,
Hmm.
and because different people have different personalities, like the person has to be receptive in some way anyways for the street epistemology, because otherwise, like you'll see a lot of people, they avoid Anthony Magnabosco because they know that he probes, but their teachers and their religious leaders tell them to avoid people like him, right? Because they don't want them, I guess they don't really want them to think about what they believe and why they believe. They just want them to cling on because of blind faith. And with other people though, you have to own them because they start getting egotistical, thinking they own you, and you just got to put them in their place. Like there's no other way to put it. Like I think it's just a good mix of both. But yeah, like I have had great conversations even through Twitter about religion. Like there was this one. She was a Muslim convert who I had a conversation about, sort of explaining why I was a Gnostic atheist, and she was like, "Oh, okay, that kind of makes sense," because I was more on the realm of saying like I personally believe like that the gods of like your religion and other religions have contradictory what is it? Contradictory I can't I lost the word characteristics, right? And I even went on to say it also doesn't make sense that like the whole idea of God outside of religion doesn't really make sense. It doesn't mean much. What are you defining it as? So I even went into why I think it's at least important to define what you mean when you say God, right? To at least define what you mean by that. And she came to an understanding. It was actually surprisingly good conversation. I don't know if she valued it as much as I was appreciative of her inputs and her actual listening. But I did appreciate that. Don't get a lot of that usually on Twitter. It's usually a place where nuance goes to die, as they say. But
I
that was actually
refuse to
surprising.
debate. Yeah, I refuse to debate on Twitter. It's a complete shit show sometimes. I always have to remind myself that Twitter is not real life, that the general public opinion of Twitter is completely diametrically opposed to what the general public opinion is in the United States. But hey, man, it was fantastic to have you on. I think you're a rising star, and I hope everyone follows you and subscribes to your YouTube channel. Any closing comments you want to give off?
um, I'll just say like follow me on Twitter at Malik Lendell. Um, look forward to some of my posts. I'll just share anything about atheism, secularism, humanism, my favorite music, and that's it.
Well, thanks for coming on, man. It was a joy. Thanks.
Thank you.